Jordan Peterson started his Exodus series about God. Let's see what he has to say about how to strengthen yourself through suffering.
Is a leap of faith, not God's existence.
Right. But I think it's the leap of faith, because in some sense what you do is you decide that things are good and you're going to act in the service of the good in many ways despite the evidence.
Yes.
Right. So that's why it's an act of faith. It's like, well, yeah, you know, you can understand arguments for nihilism and despair, especially if you meet people who've been brutalized beyond belief. But then now and then you meet someone who's been brutalized beyond belief, and instead of being corrupt and nihilistic, they've pulled out of that a goodness that's so deep that it's miraculous. And you meet people like that pretty damn often. And they've decided, despite all this, and it's sometimes that's so brutal you can't even listen to it, despite all this, I do believe that things are good, and I will serve the good, and that's faith.
But yes, but they're not in those cases. They're rarely doing so without their own evidence. I mean, they're precisely the people who are able to illuminate to you, you know, the abiding underlying goodness, because they're actually connected with it. It's not doing this in a vacuum.
People usually, it's maybe associated with the burning bush idea. I mean, I'm thinking of an artist that I've worked with for a long time who was brutalized beyond belief when he was young. And he found his salvation through beauty. And so it was like the burning bush. He noticed that despite how catastrophic his life had been and how tyrannized he was in the most fundamental sense, beauty beckoned to him, and he heeded the call, and it completely transformed his life and his character, his career, everything.
Right, so it's not as if it's simply against the evidence. I mean, there is, that is to say, there is.
Yeah, that's so interesting, too, because he was still, despite all that, he was still open to the possibility that there might be something, that there might be something beyond the catastrophe, right?
But isn't part of the answer what we're saying?
To be honest, what makes people strong in those bad situations, when you hear people who come out of Guantanamo Bay or something like that, and some of them are Muslims, a lot of them actually, come on, let's be honest, a lot of them are Muslims, who have been unjustly detained for 10 years or something. And they tell stories how they were humiliated, how they were meant to, they couldn't practice anything, they had to eat, whatever, right? Horrible stories. And they actually became more spiritual or whatever. In those circumstances, what helps you is not beauty or any sort of metaphorical idea about the world. It's actually like making sense of your suffering. So kind of like viewing yourself from a third person perspective as in a game, and you kind of know that this is just part of the game, and eventually it's gonna get better, and it doesn't have to get better in this life. And that's the entire point of having faith. We're not trying to look at results in this life, this temporary existence. And this is what Jordan Peterson, people like him, they don't get that. Like they still think in terms of this worldly life. How does this suffering make sense if this happens or that? Oh, I have to make some sort of like metaphor to understand it. No, this is complete garbage, because you will never get that. You will never be able to completely understand suffering because you don't know the point of it. There's no point into suffering, to be honest. Of course, you need the goodness to recognize there's something like evil. So there's good and bad, there's suffering and not suffering, obviously. But overall, the point of religion and the point of faith is that, okay, your suffering is meaningful, not meaningless, because in the hereafter or in the afterlife, there's some reward waiting for you, or there's some sense from it. And in a tangible way. So for Muslims, this is, as a Muslim I'm speaking, anytime you're suffering in this world, that's actually viewed amazing. Like, that's better, because what you're doing, you're actually leveling up your paradise. This is Islam. Basically in Islam, if you have, like, look at all the prophets of God, look at the Jesus, look at Moses, look at Abraham, look at Muhammad, peace be upon him, on them all. They had very difficult lives. So according to our worldly standards, poor people usually, they were protested, killed, tortured, not killed, but tortured, persecuted. They were trying to conveyed the message of God, everybody rejected them. So we see this all across the prophets, the same stories, same problems, same stories. And so you think like, oh man, these are the chosen people by God, but they have such horrible lives. Like prophets' wives died, all of his children died, all of Muhammad's children died, except Fatima, peace be upon him. All this is happening, to these prophets, and they still keep the enthusiasm. It's not because of some metaphor, or it's not because of this or that. It's because it's because God has promised them there's a paradise waiting for you. There's a hereafter. You're not seeing it. You're like a baby in the womb of your mother. You can't see the world. There is something coming after this, and you'll be in the elevated ranks of paradise, on the highest ranks. There will be other ranks, and then there's hellfire. So in that sense, that's perfect. You can make sense of suffering because each suffering is making you level up in the afterlife. This is how you make sense of it. And then some people might say, well, that's garbage. How do you believe in afterlife? Why do you think this is... Okay, we can get into discussion why Islam is true, why the Quran is preserved, all that. But that's a separate issue, because once I establish the Quran is the truth, then I accept everything which is in the Quran. And the central doctrine of the Quran is the hereafter. The central doctrine is the life after death, and the day of judgment, where everything will be made just, and your suffering will have meaning, and your suffering is only temporary. It's just in this world, and this world is not what we are striving for. We all have purpose in life, and the purpose in life is to get to the hereafter in a good shape. So that's how I would view it. But I understand people with no faith or no religion have difficulties, and this is where Jordan Peterson comes from, because he's like kind of like biblical, but not really religious, but smart, but not really that smart. He's very vague, but really specific as well. He's just for the people who are kind of like recognizing there's something wrong, but they don't really want to dive deep into something real and have a real sense of meaning and purpose. So that's my 2 cents. Let's go.
Yesterday, in the nature of God, you don't come to discover him abstractly. He's, I will be who I will be. In my actions, delivering you, caring for you, you come to know he's good. There is evidence, as Stephen is saying. Sure, isn't that the answer, Dennis, to what you're saying? We don't say he's good because it's theology principle number 15 or whatever.
But because finish.
Because we've seen the goodness of God in his actions in history or in our own individual lives or whatever.
Well, first of all, some suffering, you don't know if it's even suffering. That's the point. Like, some suffering is good for you. And actually, Allah says in the Quran, like, there's many things which you think are good for you, but they are bad. And there are bad things which you think are good, but they are not good. And there's a parable or a story of a horse, a man actually. I don't want to get into the story, but actually, it's about a guy who breaks his leg, and then the army comes, pick him up, for the army in China, and he can't go because his leg is shattered. And basically the leg was broken, he viewed it as calamity. At the end of the day, it saved him from certain death in the army. So was that really a suffering? Well, yeah, but it's still less of a suffering than the next thing. So there's levels to the game in this world of suffering. Some of it you will find meaning in here, even some of it you will never find meaning for. So some of the suffering might be because you're just part of the puzzle of the world, and your suffering was there so that other people could see it and maybe share some ideas. I don't know. There's so many things we don't know because we don't see the picture. We just see the pixel, and that's it.
It would seem to be a hard argument to make to a concentration camp survivor, that he has seen predominantly the goodness of God. However, having said that, there is an interesting book written...
Again, thinking through the perspective of everything that happens in this world is temporary, and it's just a test. Even if my life is the worst, concentration camp, I'm a homeless person, I have AIDS and I die, And then in the hereafter, I go to paradise, which is eternal. So think through this again. Eternal paradise doesn't end. Life, 50, 60 years ends. One drop of that paradise, you'll forget you ever had a problem. You'll forget all your issues in this world. Everything will be wiped out. So that's a good deal. That's a good deal. And that's what we're talking about. This small time, it's test. It's a math test. And you're going to get exam on the day of judgment. And then you're either eternally happy or not happy. There's no other option. And so that if you look at it like that, even the worst life possible in this world, it's still okay because we don't know the result. Maybe this guy will get to Jannah, will get to the paradise, and maybe the guy who had everything in this world will go to hell. So there's no scenario on this planet that you can actually break a Muslim with. It doesn't exist. You can see it in the first generation of Muslims after the Prophet died. They were ready to die. They didn't care. They just wanted to spread Islam because their mindset was all about the hereafter. They didn't think about this world. They only wanted the hereafter. And there's actually a saying from one of the scholars who says the difference between the early Muslims and the Muslims today is the early Muslims only wanted the hereafter. Today, we also want the hereafter, but we also want this world. And that's the difference. That's it.
Long ago, about the theology of concentration camp survivors. And it found that, and I don't claim that this is absolutely correct, but I'm just telling you what it reported, and it seemed to me to make sense, that the percentage of Jews who went through the death camps, and I specifically mentioned death camps, who came out, the proportions of atheists and believers was the same. Many switched. Atheists became believers and believers became, but the proportion remained virtually identical. So there are people who have only good in their life, relatively speaking, who don't believe in God. So I'm challenging my own question because I've wrestled with this because I think the hardest law in the 613 laws of the Torah is to love God with all your heart and all your soul. I long believe that's the hardest. I have no problem trying to obey
that's to
God.
throw yourself into existence fully as if it's good.
Yes,
and that's a rough one.
You see him, he's again going off to some weird idea. No, God is saying, love me with all your heart. Stop these metaphor bullcrap.
Because,
that's
geez,
right.
Look at it. It's pretty rough,
That's
man.
right. That's right.
So Solzhenitsyn was struck in the concentration camps by goodness so constantly. And it was out of that seed of the observation of goodness that the whole Gulag archipelago emerged, and therefore, in no small part, the fall of the Soviet Union.
That's a prophet. Solzhenitsyn is a prophet.
Yeah, and he said,
he's a prophet. What? This guy is a mess, Jordan Peterson, to be honest. I liked him so much 4 years ago, but now he's a mess.
That he really noticed particularly, and he was atheistic when he went into the camps, that the devout religious believers were able to maintain their moral integrity in camp.
And physical.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Not always, because he said, no, let's not push this. Sometimes people just...
Yeah.
But he saw people, and he tells very compelling stories of people who thrived and became healthier in the face of the privation under the ultimate moral authority of their own shining soul. And the stories in the Gulag, especially in Volume 2, they're unbelievably compelling. And Frankl said similar things. And Solzhenitsyn was particularly careful not to say, that doesn't mean I'm saying that everyone who failed because of their moral flaws, or that purity of heart would necessarily save you. You know, he's a complex thinker, but...
That's one of the miracles I think he saw when I was talking about him earlier, because he talked about how some people were hardy and robust. Yeah. And he was careful to say, it's not like you can secret your way to health in a gulag, right? He wasn't being flippant about it. But he was noticing that some people who had more resources...
They wouldn't cooperate with the Gulag authorities.
Yeah.
They would never become trustees, and they'd tell the...
It was Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah.
It's also the epistemic humility, though. The difference between the presumption that you know all there is and it's bad, and you're saying, I don't have it all. I mean, you think those last words that Job says at the very end of the book of Job, therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful me, which I knew not.
Right,
That
yeah.
at the end of it all saying, I didn't actually understand the whole picture.
Well, it's also hope in that, because
Yes.
Well, that's the entire point of all the stories, I guess in the Bible, but also in the Quran. You never get the whole picture. You never understand the whole picture. And the most fascinating story in the Quran is Moses when he goes to meet a man who's actually unnamed, I believe, and he has to learn from him, and he goes through 3 incidents with him. So first they go somewhere and they go on a ship, then they go in a town and help build stuff, and he always has to do weird stuff. So he has to kill someone, then they have to build a wall, and he doesn't tell him why, and at the end he finally understands, oh, we had to do this because of this and this because of this and this because of this, and at the end he says to him, oh, this is just a quick peek into the unseen, which you're not ready for. And that's Moses, peace be upon him. He's talking to Moses you're not ready for this, what I'm showing you here. So almost all stories are about this, that you have no idea what's going on. Just submit yourself. Islam means submission. Be a Muslim, someone who submits to the will of God, and you'll be fine, dude. Just for everything say Alhamdulillah, bad, good, anything, because you don't know the picture. And that's it. You're just a small pixel in the picture. But know that God knows everything about you. And and so your suffering is meaningful, and every action is meaningful. But Jordan Peterson is gonna go on a tangent about some weird stuff.
one of the things is that if you're suffering terribly, there's 2 options in front of you in some sense. One is you're suffering terribly and it's unjust, and you're suffering terribly because the cosmos itself is flawed in its fundamental structure. And that's really Cain's complaint against God. The other possibility is you're suffering at least in part because you're not everything you could be. And that's a terrible burden to take onto yourself because it's the burden of your own suffering. But it's also unbelievably hopeful because it could be that, I think maybe Frankl recounts that story. I don't remember where I read it. A woman who visited a psychiatrist and who said to the psychiatrist, I really hope there's something wrong with me. And the psychiatrist said, why? She said, well, if there's something wrong with me, there's hope because I might be able to fix it. But if there's something wrong with the structure of existence, so I'm fated to suffer in this way, then everything's despair. And the people...
Well, that doesn't make sense, right? So you have these 2 suffering categories. One is the universe. So let's say you have the second one. You have you are your own problem. Let's say you watch porn, or you take heroin, right? So let's say you want to fix that. You know you have this issue, and okay, I'll fix it. But there's still a different issue. There's existential suffering, which will lead you to nihilism, which means there's no purpose in existence. It's all for nothing. The universe is empty and it's going to evaporate at some point, and we're just pretending everything makes sense. So that's going to creep in and create a major level of depression, even if you improve. I speak from experience. I've self-improved my life. So I lost weight, I made some money, I was trying to stay healthy and all that stuff. But at some point, living just for this dunya, just for this world, wasn't enough, because it's like, why are we self-improving if at the end of the day I'm gonna die? And all of it means nothing. On the atheistic worldview. So let me explore other worldviews, because this is clearly a mayhem. It just created a feedback loop of depression and nihilism. So, whoa, that was a big one. And so you need to figure out this one first. If you can figure out this one first, this one is easier because you can self-improve. And this one is going to lead you somewhere. You will have a purpose in life. You will know where to go. You have a GPS. You're not lost in life. Oh, what am I going to do now? No, you have a purpose in finance. You have a purpose here with your wife. You have a purpose with family. You have a purpose how to die, how to live, how to raise kids, how to go to war. All of it is mapped out. Bam, let's do it. Am I just crazy, or Are these people pretending to be smart because they use big words?
People that I have seen who've transcended their tragedy and malevolence that have pursued them, they did have that sense of their own ignorance, even with regards to the conclusions they drew about their suffering.
And
So-
Frankl himself has this very odd story at the end of the book, where after this array of unspeakable horrors, he then talks about this particularly sadistic, brutal figure whom he'd known from some clinic, the Stein whatever, in Vienna or something. And then he says that he heard a story that this man, this concentration camp figure, had been sent off to a Russian camp at the end of the war, and then heard from another colleague that this brutal figure had actually been extremely humane and supportive as an inmate of a Soviet camp. And it's that very enigmatic ending of Frankl's book, where it's almost as if to say, even where you're convinced that there's evil that's irredeemable,
Right.
that maybe there's a
There's still
possibility.
hope.
There's
There's still hope for redemption.
I know that's
Yeah.
a bit. It seems like a bit, but it isn't.
No.
It's very puzzling.
Why do you think
part of the book.
why is that idea considered so dangerous?
What idea?
This idea that, because, even when
Because
you
we
were-
want it to be,
Well,
we want it to be.
immediately goes into blaming the victim. Like you even went to pains to say he wasn't saying that anybody could, right, through the inner light of their soul, come out positively in a gulag. But there's such a resistance against this notion. It's like it's almost outside the Overton window to say you can alleviate some of your own suffering by your orientation towards the world. It's almost considered a dangerous proposition now. And we have to go to pains to make caveats about it when we even mention it.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky business. When my daughter was young and she was really ill, I told her when she was very young, I said to her, don't you use your illness as an excuse, ever, because you'll confuse yourself. Then you won't know what you can do. You're going to have a hard time doing things. But if you use your illness as an excuse, if you corrupt yourself morally, which you have in some sense every right to do because of the depth of your suffering, and which would be perfectly understandable under the circumstances, it will do nothing at all but make the situation far worse.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Like, hey, you were born to a bad family, you have some disease. Well, boo-hoo, there are people in the world without legs, without eyes. So, life is suffering. This is the doctrine of life. You have this test now, let's go and pass it. Don't use it as an excuse. I mean, sometimes it can be hard, but don't use it as an excuse. Anyways, my review, 1 star out of 5. I'm really am I being too hard on them? But to be honest, I'm just using basic brain. These guys may sound really smart and they have these cool production, but the ideas are very surface level. Some of them are okay, but especially Jordan Peterson, I mean, he's a mess. I keep repeating it, and maybe his fans are gonna be pissed at me, but the man doesn't know what he's saying. He's always like, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? So it's just, there's no discussion with the guy. And it's just, after some time, he keeps repeating himself. In the beginning, it was cool, a few years back, when he had some point. Now it looks like he doesn't. He's just figuring out if God exists. And it takes him a long time, to be honest. Anyways, Assalamu alaikum. See you in the next video, inshallah.